And before I forget about it, we probably want to talk at some point about the legacy kit from that SIFWA has published that were part of, which kind of goes through managing your IP. And from a legacy standpoint, it gets you ready for everything from publication to selling to licensing rights to even what do you do in terms of your legacy. So that's probably something worthwhile to talk about at some point as well. Is pull down and talk about the legacy kit.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
that's germane, especially thinking about what we just said with Susan Wright Beard and her husband, taking those notes and posthumously publishing that book. And I know that it's of concern and interest to Jeannie, but I think it's concern to all of us. I mean, if Laura wants to pass on her book series to her daughters, and I'm grappling with it myself, Jim, as I look at hidden treasure novels and trying to set up an imprint that possibly I could leave to one of my daughters who's expressed an interest in writing. So, but yeah, that'd be great if you could cover that. And we are recording, so.
okay. Well, I'll tell you what, if you want to let me share, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to do one of those things I usually don't like to do, but because we're going to look at some blurbs through this, it's going to be helpful for you to actually be able to see some of them as well. So I'm actually going to share a PowerPoint. I'm going to apologize in advance, but only once.
Okay, you should have co-hosting privileges right now, Jim, so you should be able to share.
So,
okay.
And we'll just run this show. So this is one of the nice little slides. This is one of the nice ones that I usually call book blurbs. Why you should read my book. And so let's actually dive in. What's a blurb? Let's just sort of start with a simple thing. What is a blurb? Because we talk about book blurbs. We have a lot of ideas as to what they are, what they aren't. And this is one of those things that done right, both helps to sell a lot more books. Done wrong, costs a lot of book sales. It dissuades a lot of readers. It really does. One of those things that really matters, because the number one thing always with your book is seeing your cover. Number two is, what is that cover? Once that cover pulls me in, what's the book about? So that's really what the blurb is there for. It's a short description to grab somebody's attention. The number one thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit, is it's not a synopsis of the book. So we'll talk a bit about what is a blurb, what's not a blurb, kind of the best practices around building it. And then if we've got some time, we're going to play a little bit of the game of let's build some blurbs. So what do I use a blurb for? And so the number one thing is it goes on the back of the cover of the book, right? I mean, that's the first thing we all think of is I flip the book over, there's the information for me. Well, number two is the obvious. It also needs to go into my digital marketing places like Amazon and whatnot. But here's one of the first things to think of. Am I going to use the exact same blurb from the back of my cover of my book as I'm going to use on a digital marketplace, whether it's Amazon, a Goodreads, or wherever else? Is it going to be the right place? And we're going to talk about that. Goes on social media. So in other words, I may use that book blurb or parts of it on social media. Goes on any promo material, bookmarks, ads, things like this. Pieces of that blurb are going to work their way in. Goes on your website, because again, if you are putting your books on your website, you want people to know what they are, that they're picking up, what they're going to be reading. It might be going inside the book. That's one of those things you're going to go and say, why is a blurb inside the book? We'll talk about that. It's your elevator pitch. You want to talk to an agent, you want to talk to a publisher. A version of that blurb is your elevator pitch. Because again, if we go back to the original definition, a blurb is just a short description that grabs somebody, that gives them a reason to talk to me further or take a deeper look at the book, the product, and what you're doing. And last but not least, it goes wherever else that you're working and promoting you in the book. If you've got a flyer up, if you've got posters up, if you're running ads in magazines, if you're running ads in a convention, in the convention book, it's going to go, some version of it's going to go wherever you're looking to promote your work. And what we're going to talk about here is really, what are the things that go into a blurb? How do I tune it to the right audience? Because this is one of those things a lot of the time we forget is I also need to make sure that that blurb goes to the right place, the right audience for how people consume it. So what kind of blurbs are there? Well, there's the obvious one, which is it's my short description. In other words, this is the one that's going on the back of the book. This is the one that's going on Amazon. We're telling the reader what they're going to get. I may have a short blurb that's my bio. Why does somebody want to listen to me as the author? So if I'm writing something that is about me, my memoirs, I'm writing something that is a consulting book, I'm writing a business book, I'm writing something along those lines, I need to have a blurb that's me, just a sentence or two that explains who I am and why I'm creating this particular work. I may have a blurb that's a review. It's a snippet of a review. This is the sort of thing I might put in the first couple of pages of my book. So if somebody opens it up and looks, and they're looking at things like book reviews, well, I may create a blurb book review. So as a reviewer, a lot of reviewers give you a blurb, or they may give you that snippet. So that, that little quote that goes on the front of the back of your book that says, great book by John Smith, great reads. That's a blurb. It's a kind of blurb. It's just a short snippet. But again, it's one of those things that you want to look at and make sure is tailored to and applies to the right audience. You might use a quote from the book. So one of the things that you might be looking at or might be considering is creating a blurb that's just a quote from the book. Again, this is the sort of thing you're going to use when you're putting out promotional materials. You might have that snippy sentence or two that really frames up the tone of the book or frames up the tone of the characters. A quote from someone about you or the book. So we're back to kind of that reviews or that snippets where somebody comes out and says, John Smith is the next Stephen King. So here's the thing that we all want to talk about. How do I make a good book blurb? So a lot of these principles are going to apply no matter what it is, whether it is an article, whether it's a book, fiction, nonfiction, memoirs. A lot of this is going to apply the same way. Now, as we dive in, we're going to take a look at the difference between a fiction and nonfiction as well. But how do I make a good blurb? First of all, number one, know the expectations of your reader. Where am I putting this blurb? Is this the one going in the back of my book? Is this something going on my website? Is this something going to Amazon? One of the things that we frequently don't look at is sometimes a bigger or longer blurb can make sense on Amazon, or I might include things into my Amazon listing that don't necessarily fit on the back of a book or don't apply to the back of the book. Or if I'm sending a blurb out to a book reviewer website, I might tailor that blurb just a little bit. So you have to remember, where's this blurb going to go? It is not a one-size-fits-all type of exercise. Number two, this is one of the first mistakes we all make. Keep it simple. So a lot of the time we want to go over the top, but again, what's the book? What's it about? Keep it simple. Keep the language simple, and make sure it also is representative of the book and what you're doing. Keep it short. Because especially even if you are doing something for a digital platform and you've got the ability to write a small novella, nobody's going to read it. Again, the purpose of the book blurb is to get somebody's attention and tell them what it is. You want them to be able to make that decision. Is this something that could apply to me or interest me or not? Because again, going back to the fundamentals of marketing, you want to make sure that, not everyone is going to be your audience. There is no singular product out there on the planet that is universal to 100% of an audience. And that goes to food, drink, books, none of it. So you want to be clear about who your audience is or isn't. Your blurb needs to tell the story. You want to plan a hook. You want to set the expectations. And again, this is one of those things as we look at the structure, really think about this. Whether I am selling, how to code, I'm selling how to do accounting, or I'm selling a brand new, young adult fantasy novel, I want to tell a short story there that explains what's going on and explains and sets the expectations for the reader. So that's really the fundamentals. It's not a lot on the surface, but there's a lot that gets packed into it. And I think when we look at some examples, this will start to make a little more sense. And last but not least, as I said, explain why the book is or is not for them as a reader. Because sometimes, especially if you're creating stuff in a nonfiction space, you may create something that is too basic for what that person wants or needs. Or maybe it is, it's a starter book when somebody is looking for advanced tools and techniques. Maybe the cover looks like it's romance, but you look at the back blurb and it's really more fantasy adventure. And again, this is one of those things where you're looking at the overall packaging of any book. You want to make sure that it is congruent. The cover sets the tone. You want to make sure that the blurb you have also matches that tone. And this is why when you start looking at, especially your other marketing material, if you're putting images and things out there to run Facebook ads and you're creating the blurb for a Facebook ad, that's a very different structure because number one, you don't have the space to grab and try to set that hook and inform that potential reader when they go click on your ad. So again, you want to make sure it's a congruent message. So the image you might use for one cover or one blurb may or may not always work. And so when you're looking at it, make sure it's really all about enticing the reader. You're romancing that reader to tell them, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it. If it appeals to you, I want you to pick it up. If it doesn't appeal to you or is not your reader, honestly, you don't really want somebody that's not your reader to buy the book, generally at least, because if somebody has one image of the book and it's something else, in other words, if you don't live up to the promise you made with that blurb and with the image and with the cover and the entire package, then that's what leads to bad reviews, is because you set one set of expectations and didn't meet them. And this is really one of those things that happens a lot of the time. Is it's not that the book itself wasn't good. It's about the expectations that were set when I picked it up weren't met. And so this is one of those other fun things. We're writers. So this is about writing and revising. You need to work through and see what works. The good news is this is something like Amazon, you can always be turning and trying out different versions of the blurb. You can try out different language, but you want to go and write multiple different blurbs. And this is one of those things that, especially if you're working with critique groups, this is something that your critique partners can read and say, this is the one that nails the book, or this one misses these elements. This one grabs me, this one doesn't. You want to have multiple versions out there to take a look at yourself, but also multiple versions for people to take a look at and choose from. So this is one of those things that both gives you more tools to use on different platforms, as well as actually makes you go through the process of making sure you've written a solid blurb. So I'm going to pause for just a minute before we go on and go into the detail. Has anybody got any questions so far?
Wow. Jim, this is Vince, and I have a question. The first couple of books I wrote under a pseudonym, and I created even a persona for that fictitious writer, and I made that gave that the elements for the cover and the description that ends up on social media and the rest of it. Do you have any insights about the best practices for creating that kind of imagery for a ghostwriter, right? For lack of a better word.
Sure. So this is a great question. So one of the things that we run into and look at is, like me, I have multiple pen names that I write under. I've done ghostwriting, so I've done writing for other people underneath their names and their brands. I have the stuff that I write as me and myself. So all of them are me, but there's aspects and different flavors of persona that come out. So a lot of the time you want to make sure that if you're tailoring the persona to the genre. So for example, I know a number of people that write in multiple genres. I do as well. But let's say that you write in romance. The person you are for a romance audience and the name you use for romance might be a little bit different persona that you're tuning to than the part of you that goes and writes horror urban fantasy, because the picture that you've got of you that is on the back of the book for romance might look a lot softer, more refined, a little bit easier. If I've got one on the back of my horror novel, I might be decked out in all black and looking goth and wearing a leather jacket. No, I have not done that, but I do have friends who have. If I'm going out and writing, writing business books, tech books, things like that, I'm probably going to look, I'm probably at least going to be wearing, collared shirt, sport coat, things like this. So the images that are on the front of the book are used to help set the tone. So I'll stop for just a moment, like the book that's over whichever corner, the business book for writers. The front that sets the tone is it's a typewriter. And so we had a lot of debate about, do I use a typewriter? Do I use a laptop? I mean, if you look at the images I use at the beginning of these slides, it's a typewriter and a laptop facing off, because at the end of the day, those are just tools. But inherently, we as writers connect a little bit of romance to the idea of sitting behind the typewriter, even though it's not really the effective tool that most of us are using today. I still know a couple of writers that refuse to use a computer. They will type everything on a laptop and send it off. I'm sorry, type it on a typewriter and send it off. But there's that romantic notion that goes with that idea of the image and the cover. And so that's why we wound up going with the typewriter. Is it's a visceral image for us as authors. So the picture on the back of the book is a god awful one to me. I know that. But so when I look at the picture on the front and the wrap to the back, hopefully the image on the front and the promise that's made on the back is what's in that particular book. However, I've got other pictures of me with some of the fiction where you might find me in that particular persona. If you ever see me in person, if I if you see me at a convention, I'm up speaking on stage or something like that, 99 times out of 100, I'm going to be wearing a kilt, an obnoxious t-shirt, and something that doesn't match, just because it's hard to miss me. And I've done that. I've done that at science fiction and science fantasy conventions. I've also done that in technology or business conventions where I was speaking from stage. I might have put on a little better shirt, but again, that's part of the brand and persona of me standing up there. It's one of those things that also makes it very easy to find me at a convention. The covers I use are all things that go back to my personal style. They're things that appeal to me in one way, shape, or another. But at the same time, I'm not as attached to the picture that's on a cover. I want to make sure that it appeals to the right readers. I can't I do attach pieces of my persona to any book cover that goes out the door. It's got to be if it's something that my publisher's doing, I probably don't have a whole lot of call in it anyway. That's not my problem. They're making a decision about the cover on the book. If it's one that I'm publishing through my own publishing house or one of the small publishers I work with, then I probably have more input, or it is my choice to say, that's a cover I like, that's a cover I don't. And that's a decision that when I make that, I have to balance my personal choice and the things that reflect me. And will that attract the right reader? Well, coming back to blurbs, it's the exact same way. But for example, there are one set of covers I've done on one series that were all done by an artist that does charcoal sketch, then comes in and does digital inking afterwards, that looks much more young adult, written for that particular audience. And the blurb on the back, I tweaked between books, because when I went to something that was a little edgier, a little heavier cover, then I tweaked the language to the blurb to reflect that image and that cover a little bit more. So when you're talking about yourself and working under a pen name and a persona that goes to that pen name, again, what's more important at that point is If you're worried about the picture that's reflecting you and to the genre and the book, then you want to make sure the picture you're most worried about is the picture of you that you're putting on the book, if you're putting one there. If you're worried about the cover image and what's on there, what you're more worried about is it's sending the right message and setting the right tone, because your cover is still the first thing that sets the tone for somebody who is not looking for you or your book. It's that image, it's the title, it's how it looks and feels that grabs me or sends me off and says, this may not be my genre, this may be my genre. Then the next thing I'm going to do is, if I get that interest, is pick it up and look at the blurb. And that's where, again, we have to be very specific about the language, the word choice, and how tightly we write that. Assuming if you're writing the blurbs, if your publisher is writing the blurbs, then that's not your problem. But usually with blurbs, you do have a little bit more influence than you do necessarily about a cover. And again, that's necessarily influence. You may not have full control over that blurb. I don't know if that answered your question entirely, though.
It does. In my particular case, I have a related question, Jim, and this is on behalf of someone who wasn't able to join us tonight. Kimberly Brulette, who's one of the authors who attends our meetings, writes in paranormal. She's published 3 very successful, best-selling books in paranormal space. But she's about to launch another book that is nonfiction about the tragic death of her daughter. Her daughter committed suicide by gun, and she's written a book as almost a manual of how do you keep weapons out of the hands of people who are schizophrenic. And so there's maybe a little bit of a political element there. But what I'm getting to here, and I'm asking because I know now that we're recording this, I'll be able to share this with Kimberly after the fact. She has a persona as an author of paranormal. Are there any hints that you have for her as she constructs a blurb for a book that's 180 degrees, perhaps in the other direction? Or do the two tie together? Does the writing of paranormal perhaps maybe cross a bound in a Venn diagram sort of way with a tragic event like the death of her daughter by suicide? And does she have to change all that much? And I don't know the answer to it. That's why I'm asking what you might think about it.
So again, the real point here is not as much about the author. So, and we've talked about this, about creating that personal brand. So I'm assuming she's publishing both under her own name.
Yes, that's correct.
So it's all under the same name and the same author. So I can say that the Venn diagrams are going to at least touch, because especially if you're writing paranormal books and you're writing a lot of the elements you usually find there, seeing the other book becomes one of those things that really informs you about the author. It tells you about their personal experience that is educating their fiction. Because no matter what you do, whether we think about it or not, whether you're writing fiction, nonfiction, especially though in fiction or memoirs or things like this, you're processing out a lot of personal feelings and emotions. I mean, so we can't help but have parts of ourselves and things that we're working on and processing come out of the fiction we're doing at any given time. Those elements are going to just come through subconsciously. So if I'm a reader of that paranormal fiction, the nonfiction book coming out and giving that personal story, especially something that tragic, and understanding more of that family history, is something that somebody who is a fan of or a reader of the paranormal books may not want to pick up and read, may not be their thing. But even seeing the book and the blurb might help inform how they view the author. So again, going back to that idea of personal brand, if we look 50 years ago, if you knew who an author was and you knew anything about them at all, it was because they were being profiled in one of a small number of media groups, or a very small number of authors that wound up on the talk shows, variety shows, things like this. Now we have an expectation as readers, and there's an expectation from our readers that they have a more personal connection to us through social media, through through a lot more platforms. And so if I'm looking at and trying to tune my message, again, it depends on what the purpose of the book is. If the point of the book is to educate about gun safety and weapon safety and handling that, and also addressing that under the auspices of mental health, the language in the blurb I'm going to use is going to be driven much more as a memoir, and it's going to be looking to address that subject. I'm not going to be necessarily using the sexy language that's going to pull somebody into, you know, here's the mystery, here's the story. There's still going to be elements, because I might come and say, part of the blurb about the book may be, I, as a paranormal fiction author, write in this space. I write it for this. But in this nonfiction book, that's a little piece of it where they go and say, yeah, this is the stuff that I write. This is the stuff that I do. This is the stuff that I'm making a living from. This is a personal expression. This is some of the things that influence me in my work. This is giving that personal view that also then educates and informs other people on why they hold the views that they do. So the blurb is going to be very different. It's going to be structured very different. But that doesn't mean that you can't carry elements, because the elements to say I'm a fiction and a nonfiction author probably tell me that there's going to be a little bit more story and craft involved in how they tell that story as a piece of nonfiction. And that it also is going to give me a deeper view into how the world can view me as a person, because again, you're now opening up and giving a lot more detail about yourself, your life, your personal experiences that your fiction fans may or may not actually want to know.
Okay.
But the language in the blurb still has to be true to what the contents are.
So I don't want to speak on for the other folks on the call here, because I want them to chime in too. But like James Polk, who's on this call, has written historical fiction. He just happens to be a distant relative of the president of the United States with the same name. Would that be something that he might want to include in a blurb on his book when it gets published, that that can let the readers know that there is a reason why he is focused in on talking about historical fiction?
Well, there's a gentleman that I don't know if you guys have met or not. I've had the pleasure to meet and spend some time with and do some panels with, by the name of Dacre Stoker, who is the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, who has currently been doing a lot of, well, not lately, but has written a prequel to Dracula, has tied a lot of this stuff to the family history, the family name. Dacre is from Aiken, South Carolina. If you have a familial connection that gives a little bit more insight, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, the ability to come and say, hey, by the way, this is part of the family history. There's a lot of value to being able to do that and work that in. So absolutely. It's, if nothing else, to come and say, if I see Polk on the front cover and I'm referencing President Polk in the book, and I know that, his house is right, or his family, or I believe his childhood house is right next to a German restaurant. Yes, absolutely. You want to use that. Somebody happens to be a fan of President Polk or searching for President Polk. I'm happy for them to accidentally stumble across my book.
Gotcha. Tommy, you've published a couple now, and you've also created some blurbs that you've used as part of your one-pagers.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, and any questions you might have for Jim on how to?
Actually, I'm thinking about the blurbs for the two books that we're going to publish this year, and how the blurbs are going to be different now. The first work is the paranormal coming of age, called Shadowed by Fear. And then the second work, which is that is in my final edit. The second work is it's called Managing Emotions and Vices. It's sort of an interactive guide. And the difference in the two blurbs that I'm going to take, the paranormal one, in the blurb, I'm going to include some teases about some of the paranormal type action that happens in the book, or the coming of age action. to sort of tease the people, yeah, that's the stuff I'd like to read about. I'd like to see how that ends. And on the self-help guide, interactive guide on helping people manage emotions, I think that I'm going to address to the potential reader saying, I've got empathy, or this book has empathy for your problems.
Mhm.
And that's why you should read it. So the first one is about the book, and the second blurb will be addressed to the potential reader. That's what I'm taking out of what Jim's talking about today.
Well, let's actually dive in and dive a little bit deeper, because I've got some more elements that we would look at from a fiction versus a nonfiction, and some blurbs to dive into and see if this kind of helps make a little bit more sense. So if I'm working on a fiction blurb, what are the main elements I want to make sure I'm accomplishing? Who's my protagonist? I want to know who they are out of the gate, so that I'm being introduced to them as soon as I start, because a lot of the time names have meanings. But even if it's just a random name, how you name your characters tells a lot about you as a writer and tells a lot about the story that's coming. What's your setup? What's your hook? So in other words, when I'm coming into the fiction story, what's the big mystery? What's the thing to be solved? What's the problem to be fixed? What's at stake? So in other words, if I know that I am coming into a fictional story, and person A has now been introduced to risk B. So in other words, there's a mystery. The Maltese Falcon has been stolen. What's at stake? Is it somebody's life? Is it the statue being destroyed? Is it something of a historical value? If we look at something like Raiders of the Lost Ark, in terms of fiction that would have a lot of those kinds of elements to it, the setup and what's at stake is the world, because of course we all know we're looking at Nazis being evil, and we're looking at the fact that they're looking at things to take over the world. Well, the setup is, I'm going to use the word archaeologist in quotes because I have some background in cultural anthropology, but we're instead of Tomb Raider, but we'll go with an anthropologist is out there gathering material from around the world and trying to make sure it's going to good homes, good purpose, and is being valued by the people and not going necessarily into private collections. So then the next thing, as a part of this setup, I want to be explaining, I'm not going to come to you and say, in the latest paranormal romance thriller from Tommy Doonan, then we're going to, and I know it's probably not paranormal romance, but it's okay.
Nope.
No corset wearing ghosts. So, in the latest paranormal romance from Tommy, we're going to have them coming through and doing. The language we use is going to help set it, because the language of a romance novel is very different than the language of a paranormal thriller or the language of a historical novel. The language we use on the blurb should also reflect the genre and the writer. So it gives me a little bit of a hook and a little bit of a hitch as to how the writer works. We want to know what's in it for the reader. So in other words, what kind of adventure I'm going to go in, because especially for reading fiction, we're going to it to escape. We're going to it to experience something else. We're going to go experience someone else's lives, the challenges, the trials, the tribulations, and how they overcame those. We want to see that. So there's that promise that we as the author are creating to the reader as to what the experience they're going to have is. So all of this is really what we want to pack up into the fiction blurb is really quick. What am I going to get? And we'll take a look at some blurbs here in a couple of minutes and do a little compare and contrast. But really, it's very simple. Who is it? What's happening? What's at stake? Give me the quick view. For nonfiction, it's going to look and feel kind of similar. Who benefits? What's in it for the reader? What am I going to gain from reading it? So if it's a memoir, maybe it's I have an interest in this person and their personal history. Vincent, if we go back to talking about the book about her personal history, weapon safety, all these elements to it, well, what's in it for the reader is seeing both her personal story and the effect of mental health crises as well as weapon safety. So that's the promise to the reader. So what's the problem I'm trying to solve? What's the story I'm trying to tell? That's a little bit different from the what's in it for the reader. The what's in it for the reader is a little bit of the what should they get from the end of it. But I also want to communicate very effectively what we're trying to solve in that description. So in other words, going back to that, I've made the promise of saying, this is a story, this is my personal story and experience about mental health and weapons. The next question becomes, is this story more about the effect of weapon safety? Is it the story more about mental health with the flavor of weapons? Is it more about how she has dealt with these personal crises and an ultimate tragedy? So it's giving that next layer of what do they really gain from this? Bullet points. I am a big fan of bullet points, especially for nonfiction, because I do a lot of the business and tech books. What are my big hits? Bam, 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 bam. Now, if it's a personal memoir, that's probably not going to apply. If this is about the 5 principles you're going to get in fundamentals of business, or this is the 5 things you're going to learn in terms of how to code in Perl and help set those expectations, bullet points can be a really easy and fast way of highlighting exactly what that nonfiction book is for. What's the setup? Well, the setup is going to be what I use to inform the who benefits and the problem I'm trying to solve. So in other words, this is going to explain how am I going to be presenting this information? Am I presenting it as the personal story? Is this presented as a mid-tier technical book? Am I presenting this as this style of history, where it is a blend of historical fact plus allegorical tales? It's how am I setting up the particular book? And again, we're back to what's in it for me as a reader. Now, you see, I kind of bookended this. Who's benefiting, what's in it for the reader, but we're back to I need to close out that promise. This is much like the old story of I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So the blurb is a little bit different usually in nonfiction, because we're going in and we're saying, here's the promise I'm making, and here's the promise I'm making as to what you're going to walk away with. And the last thing, and this is one of those things again that comes back to being important, is especially with nonfiction, this is where that bio piece comes in. So to come in and say, I'm a paranormal and thriller author, but I'm also a lifetime, or I'm an experience of this, with the family mental health trials. I can come in and say, who am I? I'm an author, I'm a consultant, I'm a speaker, I'm this. That quick 1 or 2 sentence bio, especially to nonfiction, helps provide context. It tells me what is my background, what's my viewpoint, and what viewpoint is being used to present that nonfiction info. So, and I just realized that I keep forgetting to fix that. So, what are the don'ts of creating a blurb? So we've talked a lot about the what to do. The first thing is to make sure you don't have a spelling error up there. So don't. The first thing is, especially if it's fiction, no spoilers. We're back to that thing of you want to hook the person, you don't want to give away the book. So no, you don't want to, unless part of the hook is, well, my protagonist, it was Tuesday and I died. Well, if that's on the front page, that's not a spoiler. That could be part of my hook. But, this is one of those things of no spoilers. Don't give the book away. Don't drone on. So we're going to look at some blurbs here in a minute that kind of break this rule. But generally, for fiction, you want to be 150 words or less. Nonfiction, you're in the 250 or less kind of a range. These are general rules, and not hard and fast. No cliches, no cheesy lines. So in other words, when you're putting this out there, unless that is part of the character and part of the characterization of the novel, generally cliches are cliches, and they're tired and they're worn for a reason. They're not going to help you. They may help set the tone of the book, and that may be a bad thing. So generally, no cliches, no cheesy lines. There are ways to use them properly, but you have to be very considerate and careful about how you do it. Don't summarize the book. It's not a synopsis. So in other words, no spoilers, And don't tell somebody the entire story of the book. This is not IMDb where you're going out and give me the plot of the movie. This is, I just want enough to hook me to the story. I want to be told what the story is, what the genre is, and give me that promise and commitment. Don't give away the punchline. I've seen this happen way too many times where somebody thinks they're being clever and they give away the punchline to the story because they think that's the hook. Well, instead of giving the hook for the reader, you've actually given them the story and the plot, and they don't finish the book. Don't come in and say exactly how amazing, fantastic, or trendy it is. That's up to the reader to decide.
Yeah.
If you have reviews that lead to that, and again, that's a different kind of blurb, it's something you might put on there that's somebody else's opinion, but your blurb should not say exactly how amazing you are, because that's going to typically tell people a lot about you, and it's typically not going to be seen as a great thing unless your name happens to be Stephen King or something like that, where everybody knows your name, in which case you don't have to tell them how amazing it is.
Yes.
Which leads into this. Don't compare yourself to somebody else and say, I am the next Stephen King. I am the next J.K. Rowling. I am the next whatever, because that also is probably going to be your last book. So, what's the story? We're going to go through a little exercise here, and I want to play a little game, and I want you guys to tell me what the story is based off the pitch line I'm going to give you. I have an orphan raised by a doubting aunt and uncle, contacted by an old family friend, whisked into an adventure, spun off into, the great unknown. They then meet an older, wiser mentor who dies. He has an obvious love interest that runs off with his best friend.
Wow.
Would you like to tell me what this story is?
The story of your life, Jim?
No, this is just a Tuesday for me, but famous. Everyone will groan when you see me bring it up. Nothing?
Andrew Cuomo?
Yeah.
No. Of course.
And just about every other fantasy novel.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at and talking about the elements of the story and the elements of the blurb, what becomes important about the story you're telling? Because remember, we talked about what goes into a blurb, what goes into the elements of story. If I'm making a promise about the genre I'm in, because obviously these are two completely and totally separate genres, two completely and totally separate audiences. Now, yes, there's a lot of crossover, but if I'm looking at that and we're talking about the two audiences here, we're making two different promises. The promise I'm going to make to somebody that's going to Harry Potter, there's a certain commitment of age range in there. There's a certain commitment of magic. There's a certain commitment of wizardry and coming of age. Star Wars: A New Hope is a little older age range, not much, but a little older. It is space opera. There's space wizards. There's space swords. There's a lot of elements that are in common, and there's a lot of common elements to both stories. But how the story is told is very different. So if we look at the blurbs for these two, Harry Potter. And again, this is kind of pulling it up. Turning the envelope over, his hand trembling, Harry saw a purple wax seal bearing a coat of arms, a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake surrounding a large letter H. That sets a very visual image immediately. I know automatically what my genre is. I know that this is taking me on an adventure. I see immediately that there's going to be magic and fantasy here. Then we go straight into who's my protagonist. Harry Potter has never heard of Hogwarts. So I now have my protagonist and I have my location. The letters start dropping on his doormat at number 4, blah, 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 blah. We go, oh, grizzly aunt and uncle. On his 11th birthday, a giant man shows up We find out who my escort is, who's going to carry me off into magic. I now set up Harry is a wizard. He's going to Hogwarts school, and incredible adventures ready to begin. I have set all of my elements, and I've done it in a very quick, very, very tight writing. And in fact, I would probably tighten it up a little bit more than this, other than the fact we threw a few elements in here to help set the age range. So in other words, we've thrown in the 11 years old. So I know how old my protagonist is when he starts the book. We know about the aunt and uncle. So they don't have to tell me he's an orphan. I can make a pretty good bet that he's an orphan because he's being raised by an aunt and uncle. That is a traditional trope. So we've been told a lot here by as much what hasn't been said as what has been. Now, because this is a major book, we now see something also having become one of the classics of our time, Harry Potter books, blah, 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 blah. This is one of those things that becomes a part of the blurb because it's something we know. It's set it up. It's earned that right to have this. But if if this is its first release and nobody's ever heard of Harry Potter, of course I'm not going to know about the boy who lived. I'm not going to see a lot of these elements because they're not going to make any sense to me, because the boy who lived is not part of our vernacular. It's not become part of culture. But including something like this is something that creates part of that cultural memory. If we then take a look at Star Wars, I got my protagonist, Luke Skywalker. That's a name that resonates. Even if, the first time you ever heard Luke Skywalker, the name resonates. So I've already got power in the name. And then it's like, lives and works on his uncle's farm on a remote planet, middle of nowhere, bored beyond belief. He's looking for adventure, and then he gets more than he counted on.
Yeah.
He gets the princess. He's, who's being held by the dark and powerful warlord. I could take this, and if we changed a few words, I wouldn't know any difference between if this was an epic fantasy and if this is space opera. But the choices of a few of these words, like furthest galaxies, distant worlds, it's a fantasy novel being told in space, which was one of the problems when they were trying to originally sell this. But now this is set many tropes and many genres. So I can see those very specific elements based on the word choices that have been made in this description. And then what do we also wrap this up on? Headed straight for a desperate encounter on the enemy battle station known as the Death Star. All of that really packages and ties up a lot of information. And again, it goes on a little bit longer description. It's not as tight in what is many ways a very classical story, but all the language is here to inform how long of a trip am I going on. This is also a longer description, which again leads to me looking at this as a different style of journey. Now, for those of you who may not have seen it, and I've actually had the great pleasure of performing a couple of different versions of this at conventions before. There's also something called Verily A New Hope. There is an author who has created Shakespearean English versions of all of the different Star Wars scripts, all 9 books. I've had the fun of being multitude of characters in stage plays based on this, and I'm not sure how I lost a bet and did it, but it's a tremendous amount of fun. But again, this is based on the same mythology, the same information, but look at how, and granted, if I read this Star Wars, I'm setting the tone for the story. This is making the assumption that you know the story, you know what you're going to get, and we're telling you more about what you're going to get, how it's being interpreted. I'm not as worried about telling you the story because you already know the story if you're buying this book. I'm telling you how it's going to be told. So I'm seeing here, returning to the galaxy far, far away. I'm already making the assumption you're a fan. With a sublime retelling of George Lucas's epic Star Wars in the style of the immortal Bard of Avalon. So in other words, all of that's relying on a lot of cultural memes and cultural history we hold. Star Wars is a major cultural event. And we also all know who Shakespeare is. We know what the style is. We know if we're a fan of it or not. And then it's the wise, the saga of a wise Jedi Knight and an evil Sith Lord and a beautiful princess. We're again setting this up to be very simple, very straightforward. it's a classical story and a classical play. It could just as easily be Hamlet as it could be this, except for the fact it's set in a galaxy far, far away. And it's more about explaining what you're going to get. That's where the reason, looking at authentic meter, stage direction, movie scenes, all of this leads you to understand, the story, how the story ends. That's not what's important. It's about how it's being told to you. So this is where understanding style and understanding audience becomes very critical as to how you're communicating those expectations. So if we look at some nonfiction, this is one of my favorite, most referred books. It's called Never Split the Difference by Christopher Voss. If I'm looking at something from a nonfiction standpoint, this is a semi-autobiographical story because it tells his history of going through becoming a hostage negotiator, things he's had to deal with. But there's also the tactics that he teaches about how negotiations work, how you can apply this to sales, how you can apply this to save a life. This is one of the books that I have referred more people to than anything else, is because there's a tremendous amount of interesting story in here, especially if you're writing fiction. If you're writing adventure fiction and you haven't read this, what you gain about understanding how people think, work, act, and how they're motivated is extraordinarily fascinating. Beyond that, you can see what's here. It's being told like a novel because it's like after a stint policing the rough streets of Kansas City and Missouri, he joins the FBI, he winds up in New York. This starts out like a thriller. So I'm already setting a little bit of a commitment here about how the story is going to be told. But then takes you inside the world of high stakes negotiations, into his head, into his skills, into his colleagues, into his personal and professional life and how this went on. This makes the commitment of saying, I'm going to teach you negotiation skills that can be used to save you money on your next car, or if somebody decides to take your kids and you don't have a particular set of skills, that you might have at least an understanding of what's going on. So especially for fiction writers, this is a book I recommend you read, especially if you're doing adventure or things like that. It's an extraordinarily good resource. The Subtle Art of Not Giving Up. So this is a book that I brought up, and I actually have got it. I've read it, and it's okay. And I want you to look at exactly how long and droning this particular blurb is. It is just as much about rambling everywhere and going on. It makes the promises, it makes the commitments, and it's just as rambling as the book is. So I know people that have loved the book. It's influential. There's value in the book. But at the same time, this could have been a lot tighter, and so could the book. And in the promise it makes, setting the expectations and everything else. This blurb is very much about telling you how smart it is instead of making the promise of what the reader is going to gain. Now, if we look at another one here, again, this one is going to kind of break that length. Greenlight, Matthew McConaughey. This is a memoir, but it's also his life lessons he's trying to teach. If you look at this, it's also a little bit longer, but it also gives you very much about how the style of the book is written. It goes through, and as you can see, the first couple of things are making a commitment. #1 bestseller. Who's it coming from? Academy Award-winning author. I then have a review from Mark Manson, whose book I just referenced a moment ago. So again, you can see that I'm getting somebody who is considered at least an authority or a principal blurb. So I've gotten the first 2 blurbs here already before I get to the main blurb about the book. I'm selling it by, hitting up here a blurb about #1, New York Times bestseller, because that's where it's already hit. It's giving you the promise from a famed author who's an Academy Award winner. So if I'm looking at this book, I'm already knowing who he is. The next thing here is the commitment in the blurb that comes from somebody giving, in essence, a review. The weight of the review and the person you pick with the review is going to weigh in. If you value that person's opinion, it has weight. If you don't value that person's opinion, that also can have weight. So when you're putting someone's blurb on the back of your book, you have to consider who that is and the audience they carry, because that's what they're bringing to you or taking away from you. Then we see here that this is written in first person. Most of the time, they're going to tell you to write your blurbs in third person, even if it's about you. But again, by writing this in first person, you're also being told here that this book is going to break some of your preconceived notions about this kind of a memoir book. It's written in first person. I've been in this life for 50 years, trying to work out its survival for 42. I've been through this. I've been through good. I've been through bad. I sat down. I went through. Here's the journey I went through, and here's what you're going to get out of it. He's saying this is my love letter to life. This is his personal statement, commitment to you. So when you read this blurb, instead of being that impersonal third party, this is him almost writing a letter to you personally in the blurb and saying, here is how I'm writing. Here's my writing style, because he gives you a lot of information from his writing style just based on the back blurb. And so by subverting a lot of the things that we expect as readers, third person, all the other things, you're already setting some of the expectations and that commitment with the reader that if they like what they see here, they're going to like what they see inside the book. So that's kind of a different set of blurbs, nonfiction, fiction, kind of crossing all the different spaces. Some stuff I like, some stuff I don't. And again, personal taste feeds into all of this. But that kind of gives you views of the things that look and do and don't. And I'm not as focused about the things that I don't necessarily like, because I don't want to put those in your heads. What I want you to look at and think about is, what are the things that appeal to you? How do you grab somebody? So I'll pause for just a moment again and see questions, comments. What have you taken out of it so far?
I kind of have a question for Laura. Laura, your publisher was, developed the blurbs for you. Did you have input into the content of those blurbs, or did they just run the whole show for you?
Oh, no, I wrote all the blurbs.
You
They
did.
didn't write anything for me. Yeah, they didn't do anything for me. No.
They did not. Okay, so did what you write, was it consistent with what Jim has shared with us this evening?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mhm.
Are
I've
there-
only had experience with specifically fiction, specifically fantasy. So that's the only thing. So he went in, a lot deeper. But yeah, as far as like what I've written, it totally lines up with everything you said. So yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to validate, because I'm thinking of some of the other authors who've been published in our group, and some are self-published, some have gone the traditional route that you did, and I wasn't sure how much input you got from the publisher. My sense is that they're not giving a lot, that they are relying on the authors to tell their stories. So when Jeannie comes up with the Junkyard Dog and Christina comes up with her book yet to be titled, these are things that we probably want to be thinking about. The credibility. I mean, in Jeannie's case, as a nurse and coming from a background where she has some authority to speak about anger management, I think that should be incorporated into the blurb in the back of the book. So not for the kids who are reading it as much as for the adult teachers who are buying the book on behalf of the students, right? Tommy, I'm not sure. I know you've written pretty much all your own blurbs. Are they consistent with what you're hearing from Jim?
Yeah, definitely. Like when Jim talked about like writing a blurb for nonfiction, the key is the benefits. I'm sort of the book, as I write the book, I'm addressing the people that are reading the book, and the blurb's going to be written in the same perspective.
Okay. I can speak from my own perspective. The first book I wrote was a fictionalized version of our memoir, and written under a pseudonym. And basically, I just focused in on the persona of that pseudonym, Jackson Bagino one. The second book, called Neverborn, dealt with a lot of issues surrounding the nature of life. It wasn't designed to be a pro-life or a pro-choice discussion, but it was designed to get people thinking about when does it start and what does it really mean, with an opening quote from Jeremiah where basically it says, I knew you before you were formed in the womb of your mother. But on the back cover of the book, I got 4 quotes, one from a pastor, one in local pastor here, one from a person who is a grievance counselor, grieving recovery counselor, so that there was some credibility that people are going to read the book. The kinds of folks that gave quotes about the book, I hope will resonate with the people who are going to read the book. Jeannie, I think you read that book, right?
I did.
So did the back cover with the endorsements from those 4 people, the pastor, the grief counselor, did that capture your interest at all before you opened the book?
Yes, because as a woman to whom this book was written, having lost a child, knowing that there were people behind the story that actually knew the journey was very important to me, because we can write a book in our minds and in our imagination that never would touch the real account of what the journey was, how the journey happened in the heart and in the very soul of a woman. So it was important to me to see that there was something behind this than perhaps just your imagination, that this was real and it was credible. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know, because you never know until it hits the street whether it's effective or not. And one thing Jim said earlier on is that we can change it up. And while I can't easily change the book cover without some effort, I can change the blurb that might end up in social media or up on Amazon. And so that's putting some thoughts in my head here.
Vincent, my daughter-in-law, also lost a child. And when I was telling her about your book, she asked me, is this his personal account? Is it verifiable, or is it his imagination? So I think knowing that on the back cover you can read, you really knew what you were talking about, that these people verified that was really important. Because there is a book called, I believe, Tilly is the name of the book. And the story is about abortion. And I read that, and it doesn't hold the heart and the soul of a book like yours did. It read like it was a fantasy.
Okay.
I've lost this child, now she's in heaven, someday I'll meet her, blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't comparable at all.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I included in the book was a bibliography of books that I used as part of my research. The story itself was based on true life events in my family, but I didn't want it to be a book about abortion or, like I said, pro-life or pro-choice. I wanted it to be about the very nature of life. And so I'm still struggling with how to create a blurb that might get to that. And I guess the question might be for Jim. In that particular book, because I think the reference to a scripture from Old Testament might resonate with people who are versed in the Bible. That that quote from Jeremiah, where I knew you before you were formed in the womb. I tried using a similar quote or two in my first book to describe the nature of the importance of being called by name, referencing a quote from Isaiah. And I'm wondering if in the construction of your blurb, if it's helpful to quote either a Bible or quote a book of quotes like, you know, The Joy of Living, or something out there where people might know immediately, connect what that quote means to a broader picture of the book.
Well, it really depends on, and because if you're quoting scripture and you're quoting something from, if you're using a Bible quote, for example, because you're going to be quoting that, and because you're going to be listing out there, you know, chapter and verse, that's going to be one of those things. And most often we're going to use Bible quotes that are often used or misused. And so there can be power in how you do that, or it can also be a speed bump for you, because again, it's setting an expectation. So, and one of those things is, if you're using that, then you're setting an expectation on what the book is delivering. You're setting an expectation on how the book is written. If you are using a quote, and you can use something from a spiritual text much easier than you can from, if you're using something from a classical historical text, you can do that something much easier than if you're necessarily quoting something from a more modern work. Because number one, if you use a quote from a more modern work, that's one of those things that also you can, so let's say that you pull a quote from, you know, from something that's been published in the last 5 years. You're then conveying, you know, whether you intend to or not, that conveys a certain message with the book, but that also can be construed as saying that's a person that's given you permission to link their work to yours.
Okay, so, but if you go back to antiquity, and you quote something, something like "Et Brutus," right? Something from Shakespeare or beyond, before that, to not to give away the story, but to help readers understand that here's going to be a plot element, right? Somebody's going to get stabbed. The Ides of March. I don't know. You pick any number to suggest that somewhere in this book there's going to be a betrayal. And I'm just wondering if that, just a short quote like that, doesn't have to be from the Bible. Like I said, it could be from literature. If that somehow is appropriate to insert into a blurb.
It can be. And again, this is back to, what have you written? How is it written? And does it create a contract between you and the reader that you fulfilled? And so, for example, I'll give you an example. So let's say that you're using a piece of scripture. I can use the exact same piece of scripture on a nonfiction book that has Judeo-Christian overtones. I can use the exact same piece of scripture on a horror novel. It may apply, and it may set tone and context, or but either way, if I see it, I know it's setting an expectation. And so it's one of those things that's hard to say as a universal, because if you are using a piece of scripture and that sets the tone for the book, or using a piece of scripture that sets the tone for every chapter, then absolutely that becomes appropriate. If you use that at the beginning of the book to set the tone for the book, absolutely, as long as you've then fulfilled the rest of the contract you've created with the reader throughout the rest of the material. If you use a quote that, and this is one of those things that comes down to a lot of the time, context is, are your readers going to have it in the same context you've presented it in? And that is both the benefit and the risk of anything that you use. Is the context you're using it in the same way your reader is going to interpret it, or can it be misinterpreted?
Right, and I think too, Jim, one of the other risks that you run is that it can change over time. When I wrote my first book in 2015, I wrote it with a focal point on Isaiah 45:3, which is a scripture that's basically says, "I called you by name, right? And that was the premise of the book, that everyone's called by name to be saved. Fast forward a few years to Donald Trump becoming president, and all of a sudden that exact same passage, Isaiah 45, was used to validate the fact that he was the chosen one because he's the 45th president.
Yes.
So something that I used in 2015 to talk about the nature of life, to talk about the beauty of being called by name to be saved, all of a sudden transformed into something that had a very political overtone. And so now I have to go back and rethink all of the swag that I had and all of the blurbs that I had put out there relative to that in social media. Again,
Exactly.
too hard to go change the book, but I can change other elements. So,
Well, and there's one other thing to consider as well is this. If you were, especially if you're using scripture because you're using translations, is you have to consider the specific translation you're using. Because and amongst all the other things that I've done is I've actually worked on translations from Greek and Aramaic and other languages and studied the historical context of the language that was originally used in comparison and contrast to the translations that we use now. And how we translate something today is different from something we translated 20 years ago, which is definitely different from something we translated 400 years ago. So you have to also be very cognizant of the translation you're using and the language that's being used in that particular translation.
great. Wow. Yeah, I'm mindful of the clock here, guys. We're running close to the 8 o'clock. I don't want to cut anyone off. I want to ask anyone out there, are there other questions you have for Jim before we adjourn for the evening?
I'd like to ask Jim a question. It's kind of a preliminary question, really. When you begin to write your blurb, is this something that you send along with your manuscript to the beta readers? Or is the blurb something you think about after the beta readers have proofread and I mean, is there steps to doing this? Does it need to be after or before or within the manuscript? I guess that's my question.
And that's a good question. And this is another one of those things that is a big, it depends. It depends on who your readers are. If you're sending something out to alpha readers, you want them to focus on the story. Because if you send out your blurb with it and you set if I give somebody my blurb and I don't live up to the promise in the blurb when they go read the book, I may taint their view of the book by what they read with the blurb.
Oh.
I would rather have them read the book, give me the feedback, give me the critique, do the rewrites, do the work, and then send a blurb that says to the next group that says, then, great, you read the book, blah, blah, blah. Here's the blurbs I'm considering. Here's 5 or 10 or 20 blurbs I'm using. Which one of these is the best representation to you?
Got it. Yes. Yes, of course. Thank
Because one of the things, if you're trying to get critique on the book
you.
and a blurb at the same time, number one, you're probably going to rewrite that book several times between the time that the critique partners get it and what goes out the door. So if I give somebody a bad blurb, I may have set a commitment, and the reason that the book runs into problems with edits is because they read the blurb and built a visual image in their mind of what they expected, and I didn't live up to the commitment with the book.
I see. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Other folks, Laura, James, Christina?
I'm good, thank you.
You're good? Laura, you're good? I saw the thumbs up. Mr. Polk, you okay? Okay.
So was this helpful tonight?
Yes, definitely,
Yes.
definitely.
Mhm.
So thank you, Jim. I just want to put a couple of housekeeping issues out here before we adjourn. The next month, in April, at our meeting, we are going to have a guest joining us from the North Carolina Storytelling Guild. And it occurs to me that all of us are writers, but we are also storytellers. and we all have different levels of comfort about getting in front of a group of people, or even being on a Zoom call in front of an audience. But I think there's a lot of synergy between what that group is doing and what our group is doing. And I'd encourage you guys to be on that call and invite friends, especially if they like to tell stories, to be on that call. And then we could start to talk about how the organizations might create some joint projects. Also, April is the month of the North Carolina Writers Network State Conference, Spring Conference. So if you haven't signed up for that, I encourage you to go do that. You can pay as little or as much as you want. They waived the fees this year because of COVID. So the master classes as of today are all booked up. So the Thursday and Friday sessions are not available, but the Saturday and Sunday sessions are still wide open. So you can take advantage of that. And if you want to, you know, contribute $30, that's fine, or less, or whatever you can afford. And for those of you who've been on one of these before, Tommy, you and I were at the conference last year together. I think we can attest to the value of those sessions. And Jim, we need to get you in front of that group and have you as one of the presenters. So those are the two things I wanted to bring to your attention. The newsletter, we'll keep it going. For the next issue, I'd like to talk about some success stories and about beta reading the stuff that you guys are producing. So Jeannie, we want to get your book out there for beta readers, and
Okay.
Laura, as your next work comes out, and Hope and Christina. So there's, you know, Jim threw out the word alpha reader and then beta reader. There's a difference. I think we are beta readers. I might be an alpha reader for Christina because we're at the very beginning of her manuscript. But for once it gets beyond that stage, then we obviously want to give meaningful feedback. One of the things that I've seen as help is the cross-reference, the cross-pollination inside of our books, in our swag. So, you know, he's not on the call tonight, but Alberto Perez was kind enough to include some of your names in his books. And I think, you know, they pick up a book by Alberto on the Second Coming, and all of a sudden, oh, I see Laura's name's in here. Maybe I want to go take a look at her book, right? And so the more we as a group stay connected as a tribe of authors, the more leverage we can get and leverage that newsletter, leverage the social media, the Facebook, and events like this Zoom meeting. I think it makes life just a little bit easier in this lonely world of writing. And then Jim has a whole tribe of authors, expanded tribe, continual. And I encourage all of you to take a look at that and participate there.
Yeah, and since we're talking about beta readers and critique groups, we actually just did a workshop and a panel on that. I don't remember if it's dropped yet or if it drops next week. I've got to go look, but we actually just did including Jeannie Adams, that was on last month, but we had, we just did a I don't know, hour and change about critique groups, how to work with them, how to structure them, what works well, what doesn't, you know, different levels of critique and that sort of thing. So we just did a show about that a couple weeks ago.
Wonderful.
And one more shameless plug.
Yeah.
So Con Carolinas is in pre-sale and will be a live and virtual conference. It's going to be hybrid. And if you've not been, especially if you're writing in science fiction, fantasy realms, but even just as a writer's conference, there is, it's a great convention to come and meet writers, as well as a lot of workshops. Right now we're trying to work on what's going to be live and what's going to be virtual. So just as throwing that out there as well.
Wonderful. Well, Jim, thank you for